The field of broken metal. The battlefield was silent after the storm of fire. Only the wind moved across the desert moon, carrying the smell of melted iron and burned sand. The sky was a dull red filled with drifting ash and the sound of distant thunder from guns fading into nothing. For hours the armies had fought here. Human marines beside alien soldiers against the hive swarms that had poured from the broken cliffs. Now all that was left were wrecks of walkers half buried in dust and the weak beeping of distress beacons calling for help that would not come among them. A lone figure lay half buried in metal shards. Her armor cracked. Her lower body gone, the blood drying in dark streaks on the pale stone. Her name was Zira, daughter of the 7th Talon, a warrior of the Cathari clans known for their pride and perfect discipline. She had fought until the very end, until the mine tore through the ground under her and took her legs away. Even now her claws tried to dig into the sand, trying to crawl toward her rifle lying only a few meters away. But her strength was gone and her vision faded to black. Each breath came slower, and she waited for the end to come, because no warrior of her people expected rescue after defeat. But somewhere beyond the dunes, a human marine named Marcus Hale moved through the wreckage. His armor scratched his rifle low. Scanning for any survivor beacons, his unit had been ordered to pull out before the enemy regrouped, but Marcus never ignored a call for help. His tracker blinked weakly with an unknown signal, faint and distorted. It did not match human codes. He should have left it behind. But something in him refused to walk away. He followed the signal across the dunes through the ruins of burned tanks and twisted hulls until he saw the shimmer of alien armor half buried in dust. He slowed, approached carefully, weapon ready. But when he saw her, what was left of her, he lowered it. At once. She was barely alive, her chest rising in, small shutters, eyes dull yet aware, watching him with the last spark of a fighter. Marcus knelt beside her and looked at the torn armor, the severed wires and the blood seeping through cracks. He spoke quietly. Easy. Soldier. You are still breathing. She did not answer. His words meant nothing to her kind, but the tone carried across languages. Calm. Steady human, he said again, pointing to his chest. Marcus. She blinked once slowly as if trying to understand, then whispered something in her own tongue. It was a rough sound like gravel, but he guessed the meaning helped maybe or ended either way. He shook his head. No. Not today. He pulled open his med pack and began sealing the wounds, his gloves shaking as he used the last of his biofoam. It hissed and hardened around the torn edges. The bleeding slowed. She hissed in pain but did not fight him. He looked at the stumps where her legs had been and felt his stomach twist. No evac would come for her. They barely had ships for their own. He checked. His comlink static-only command had pulled back beyond the ridge. He was alone with her. And the night was coming. The temperature would drop fast enough to kill them both if they stayed exposed. Marcus found a half-destroyed crawler nearby, its hull split open, but the inside still offered cover. He carried her piece by piece, armor heavy and his back burning each step, sinking deep into dust. When he finally set her inside, he sealed the gaps with metal sheets and set a small heat coil between them. She watched him the whole time, eyes half open, silent when he gave her a sip of water from his suit line. She drank without a word, her hands trembling. Marcus leaned back against the wall, listening to the wind outside. It sounded like whispering. Ghosts. He looked at her again. Her armor markings were bright red lines cut by battle damage. He remembered the reports of Cathari warriors, proud, brutal, never surrendering. Yet this one looked small. Under the flickering light she tried to sit, but fell back and struck the floor with her fist, growling. He understood without words. She hated the weakness. He moved closer and said softly, "You are still here. That means something." She stared at him for a long moment, then made a gesture, placing a clawed hand on her chest, then pointing at him. It took him a while to realize she was naming herself Zira. He nodded. "Zira," he repeated, and she blinked slowly, maybe in thanks. Outside, the wind rose higher, and static filled his comm. A new message came. Through all remaining ground units, evacuate Zone 2 under orbital strike. Marcus cursed softly and looked at Zira. She could not move even if he wanted to obey. He could not carry her fast enough through open desert under drones. He looked at her, and she seemed to know she spoke one short word in a flat voice. Leave. He shook his head no. She closed her eyes angry, perhaps thinking he was a fool. But Marcus Hale had never left anyone behind. Not on Earth, not on Titan, not here. He sealed the crawler door tighter and started rigging power cells to keep the heat running. He knew the orbital guns would begin firing soon and they were sitting in the middle of the kill zone. But if he could mask their heat, maybe they would live long enough. For rescue, he used broken armor plates to build a reflector wall and covered them with sand. Sierra watched his work confused at first, then seemed to understand. She shifted herself to help pulling loose cables with her claws, though every movement made her hiss in pain. The light dimmed, the desert outside went dark under the rising twin moons, and the first drone passed overhead like a black star. Marcus turned off all lights and waited. The machine drifted past, unaware they were still alive. He looked at Zira again. She was breathing slow, her eyes half closed. He whispered, "We will make it through this." She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone, and she nodded faintly. Then sleep took her, and Marcus sat there in the dark, rifle across his knees, the sky shaking with distant thunder. And in that small shell of metal, 2 soldiers from different worlds waited for dawn, neither knowing if it would come. The sun rose, weak and red, over the desert moon, casting long shadows. Across the broken metal fields, Marcus woke stiff and sore, his armor joints filled with dust. He blinked at the dim light inside the crawler and saw Zira still breathing, her chest moving slow but steady. The heat coil between them hummed low, keeping the chill away. The night had passed without drones finding them, somehow luck or fate, or maybe just the way the dunes shifted had hidden their small refuge. Marcus stretched carefully. His muscles ached from carrying her across the sands. He checked. His water gauge half gone, he took a sip and then offered her some through the small tube. She hesitated, then drank, eyes never leaving his face. Her gaze was hard, like someone used to command, and he respected that she tried to sit again, bracing. On her arms, he moved to help. But she hissed low and refused his hand, proud. Even now he nodded, understanding, and instead started looking through the wreckage for supplies. He found a cracked storage box, some wiring, and the remains of a service bot with enough power to maybe run a transmitter. If he was lucky, he dragged the parts inside and began working, while Zira watched her, breathing shallow. She asked one word, pointing at the pile, question in her voice. He understood enough to answer, "Trying to fix beacon." She repeated beacon slowly, testing the word in her alien mouth. The sound came rough but clear. Marcus smiled. "Yes? Beacon, we call for pickup." He worked through the morning, stripping cables and fusing circuits until the little transmitter blinked weak light. It would not reach orbit, but maybe another squad, maybe someone close. He set it to pulse at low power to avoid detection. Zira watched every move, curiosity mixing with pain. She reached for a piece of metal shaped like a clamp. He realized she was trying to build something. He passed her his knife. She took it, turning the blade in careful hands, then began cutting the metal with steady, deliberate motions, even without legs. She moved like a soldier, focused and exact. After an hour, he saw what she was doing. The metal curved into a crude brace like a limb anchor for her armor. He helped tighten the bolts and fix them to her armor socket. When it locked, she pushed herself upright, balanced a moment, then fell, back, laughing, a harsh sound but real. Marcus grinned. "You will walk again." He said she did not know the words, but she knew his tone. She gave a short nod, the pride in her eyes returning. By midday, the temperature outside rose to blistering heat. The sand glowed white. The air shimmered. Marcus sealed the door to keep the worst of it out. Inside, the air grew heavy. He stripped off his helmet, wiped sweat from his brow. Zira watched the gesture. Puzzled humans sweated like rivers. Her people vented heat through their crests. She touched the side of her own neck to show the difference. He nodded and pointed to his skin hot. She smiled slightly, a brief moment of understanding between warriors from different stars. As the heat deepened, Marcus rationed their remaining water carefully, 1 sip each hour, no more. Zira did not complain. She accepted the rule like an order. In the afternoon, static crackled in his comm. He froze. The faint voice of his squad leader came through distorted hail. "We are lifting in 2 hours, repeat 2 hours, get to extraction zone 3. Marcus tried to answer, but his transmitter was too weak. He cursed softly, then checked his map. The extraction zone lay across an open plain nearly 5 kilometers of bare. Sand under enemy control, no cover, no chance to move unseen. He looked at Zira. She met his gaze calm, but she could read the truth in his face. She asked one word. Go. He shook his head. He could not carry her that far with drones watching. She seemed to think for a long time, then pointed at herself. Then at him. Then at the horizon. She was saying, leave me go. He clenched his jaw. No. His eyes said it. Even if his mouth stayed silent, she slammed her hand against the metal wall, angry, then turned away. He felt the weight of her pride pressing against his stubbornness. Night began to fall again, long shadows crawling across the dunes. Marcus stepped outside, briefly scanning the horizon. Flashes of light far away marked the continuing battle. Maybe orbital bombardment, maybe another unit trapped like them. He thought of the order to evacuate and wondered if anyone would come back for stragglers. He returned to the crawler and found Zira dismantling the service. Bot's frame, she had used its joints to make a sled base, small but sturdy. She pointed to it, then to herself, then to him. He understood she was offering a plan. If he could pull her across the plain, maybe they could make it before sunrise. It was insane, but better than waiting to die. He nodded and helped attach handles using broken rifle stocks and harness straps. By the time the moons rose again, they had a working sled. They rested a short while before moving out. The desert was cooler under. Starlight and the wind had picked up hiding sound. Marcus pulled the sled with a rope around his chest muscles, straining every step. Zira rode low, scanning with her rifle scope, ready to warn him of drones ahead. They worked like a single machine. Her eyes, his legs, her aim, his strength when a searchlight swept near. She threw a thermal blanket over them and whispered a word he did not know. But he understood it meant quiet. They froze until the light passed, then moved again. Halfway across the basin, they found a crater filled with twisted wrecks. Marcus crawled inside for cover. Zira pointed out a shattered shield drone inside its core, still flickered weakly. He pried it loose. It might serve as decoy heat. He set it up behind them, powered it just enough to glow. Then they moved on, using the false signal to draw attention away. It worked twice. Drones circled the wrong area, firing into sand while they crept farther east. Dawn began to touch the horizon when Marcus's legs nearly gave out the weight of armor sled and exhaustion crushing him. Zira noticed, reached forward and pressed her hand to his shoulder. Her voice low, steady. She spoke her language, but he caught the rhythm of encouragement like a chant from an old battlefield. It gave him one more burst of strength. He dragged them the last few hundred meters until the ground began to tremble under distant engines. They reached a line of shattered stones where Marcus collapsed, panting. Zira scanned the sky through her visor and saw faint trails, the human shuttles lifting under escort. They were too far. She turned to Marcus and shook him, pointing upward, desperate. He tried his calm again, static, then a voice, faint. Hail confirm signal. We see movement. Hold position for beacon burn in 30 minutes. Marcus laughed, weak and wild, then slumped back against the stone. He looked at Zira. Her face streaked with dust, her eyes fierce. She managed a small smile, both of them knowing they might yet make it if they could hold until sunrise, and the world beyond the dunes would learn that 2 soldiers, one human, one alien, had refused to die alone. The sun had barely risen before the heat came again, pressing down on the desert like a giant hand. Marcus crouched behind a ridge, watching the horizon through the cracked lens of his visor. The sky shimmered with waves of dust thrown by enemy scout engines that moved in slow circles. Over the basin, he could feel the rumble of their sensors pulsing. Through the ground like distant thunder, Zira lay low beside him, her new brace limbs folded under her armor, her rifle resting across the sand. She was stronger now, though every movement still cost her pain. Her eyes narrow and bright as she tracked the search patterns above them. She could read the rhythm of war like others read words, and she spoke quietly in her rough accent to tell Marcus when to stay and when to move. He did not understand all of her language, but he had learned enough of her gestures to follow without question. They had survived the night hidden among the rocks while the small human shuttle had tried and failed to land under enemy fire. Marcus knew they were now cut off. The command had likely written them off, as lost, but that was nothing new for soldiers like him. He checked his ammo, counted the charges, 3 clips left. Not enough for another fight. Zira noticed his grim look and tilted her head in question. He just shrugged and lifted his weapon. The answer plain, she understood, and said a single short word that might have meant fight or live or both. Through the shimmering haze, a small column of dust began to rise. At first he thought it was the wind, but Zira touched his arm and pointed to the shape of moving figures, low and fast drones, small hunter types sniffing the ground with heat sensors. Marcus cursed under his breath and began to crawl backward, but Zira stopped him and drew a pattern in the sand lines and circles showing their path. She was telling him they could not run without being seen. They must trick the sensors. Marcus thought for a moment, then nodded. He pulled the power cells from his spare grenades and buried them in the sand behind a dune, wetting the surface. With coolant from his armor pack, the heat would mimic their bodies when the scanners passed over. Zira watched with interest, her warrior mind already seeing the trap. They huddled behind a boulder and waited. The first drone swept low its shadow, crossing them like a blade. The sensors blinked, then veered toward the decoys. Moments later, a flash lit the air as the grenades went off. Not an explosion, but in a bright wash of heat energy enough to blind the scanners. Zira used the moment to line up her rifle and fired a clean shot through the first drone's engine. It crashed into the sand, twitching. Marcus jumped up and finished the second with a burst from his rifle. The air filled with smoke and the smell of burned circuits. They ducked again as new contacts appeared on their sensors, bigger ones moving fast. The desert shook as heavier walkers approached, their long legs stabbing into the ground. Marcus could feel the vibrations under his knees. He knew they had minutes. Maybe less. He turned to Zira. "We need to move." She shook her head and drew another pattern in the sand, showing the timing of the search sweeps. How each walker paused every 60 seconds to recalibrate. She wanted to use that gap to slip through his respect. For her grew with every minute, she thought, like a commander, never panicking, even half-broken. They waited for the rhythm to come around when the nearest walker stopped. They ran, moving like ghosts across the sand. Zira on the sled, Marcus pulling. With every ounce of strength, the walkers resumed, and they dropped flat, hiding in a shallow dip, the dust covering them like a blanket. Hours passed in bursts of movement and stillness, until they reached the edge of a canyon filled with twisted ruins, old alien structures half buried in sand. Marcus looked down and saw shadows of arches and towers. The place must have been a city once before the wars. He helped Zira slide down the slope into the shade. The air cooler there, she rested against a wall, breathing hard. He crouched beside her, and for a while neither spoke. He looked around the ruins, thinking of how many had died here long before them. Maybe her people, maybe others. She noticed his expression and said quietly, "Old home." Her voice, soft with a hint of sorrow. He nodded, not knowing what to say. She continued, speaking slowly, as if to herself, telling fragments of memory, names of places, the fall of her clan, how she had lost her sister to raiders long ago. He caught only parts of it, but enough to feel the pain behind her words. When she finished, he told her in his own simple way about the mining station on Europa, where he had failed to save the civilians, his voice low and rough. She listened, eyes steady, no judgment, just the silent understanding of another soldier carrying ghosts. The moment passed as a distant roar echoed from above, a new wave of drones closing fast. Marcus checked his beacon. It flickered weak, then bright. For an instant, the signal burst went through, maybe reaching orbit. He smiled briefly, but it also gave away their position. Zira cursed in her language and raised her rifle. The sky filled with black shapes diving at them. They fought side by side, Marcus firing short, controlled bursts. Zira picking targets with deadly calm. When her rifle overheated, she used the butt as a club, smashing the machines that got too close. Pieces of metal flew through the air. Marcus felt a line of fire across his shoulder, but ignored it. They fought until the sand around them was littered with broken drones and silence returned. He sat back, breathing hard. Zira leaned against the wall. Her armor cracked again, but she was alive. He looked at the smoking remains of their beacon, then at the horizon where a faint glint of light moved across the upper sky. It was the fleet signal. He realized they had seen the burst and were preparing another pickup attempt in 6 hours. He turned to tell her, but she already knew, reading it from the sky. Her smile was faint, but real. They would have to hold this ruin until night and somehow survive another attack. Marcus reloaded his last clip. Zira cleaned her rifle. They sat together under the ancient arches surrounded by sand and silence. Two warriors from worlds, apart, bound now by the simple, unbreakable will to live and the unspoken promise that neither would leave the other behind. The air above the canyon burned red as the day's heat gathered again, shimmering through broken arches and melted stone. Marcus Hale crouched over the ruined transmitter, his hands blackened with oil. His armor streaked with dust. He could feel the tremor of engines in the far distance. The enemy was regrouping again, and they were running out of time. He looked at Zira, resting against a fallen pillar, her legs bound with makeshift clamps. Her eyes half closed but still bright with stubborn life. She was sharpening the edge of her rifle bayonet with slow, precise movements, her armor now patched with pieces of human plating and alien metal welded together by desperation. She looked like a warrior built from every battle fought on this dying moon. Marcus knew command would call the final evacuation soon. And when that call came, it would not include them. The fleet had already lost too many ships, and ground survivors were expendable numbers in a log. His comm crackled weakly, a distorted voice cutting through static. Sergeant Hale, transmit your coordinates negative on recovery. Order repeat transmit for orbital strike confirmation. He froze. The words hit like ice. They were about to burn the entire sector to stop the enemy advance, which meant that if he gave them his position, they would die in the blast. He stared at the comm for a long second, then turned it off. He could have followed orders, but that would mean leaving Zira. And he had made a promise to her and to himself. Long before she ever spoke his name, he would not leave anyone behind. Zira watched him, her gaze unreadable, then asked with a tilt of her head, "What did they say?" He hesitated, then simply replied, "They said we go." She studied him for a moment and seemed to understand the lie. She spoke one short word, foolish, but there was no anger in her, tone only quiet acceptance. He gathered what gear he had left and checked the horizon through the cracked scope. The nearest ridge marked the edge of the kill basin beyond. That was the extraction zone. If the fleet sent shuttles, it would be there. Between now and dusk, he would have to cross open ground under fire, carrying her weight and the sled and whatever luck they had left. Zira tried to move herself onto the sled, but her strength failed. Marcus lifted her gently, despite her protests. She struck his chest once with her hand, then stopped, realizing there was no point. He fastened her down and adjusted the clamps he had built the night before. The braces clicked into place, and she managed to sit upright, weapon ready together. They looked like a strange war machine, one human, one alien, bound by survival. The climb out of the canyon was brutal, each step sinking deep into sand, the wind cutting across his visor, carrying the taste of dust and ash overhead. Faint shadows moved, drones, searching again. Zira kept her scope on them, whispering warnings in her own language, her voice calm like a veteran guiding a rookie through a minefield every time she spoke. He listened without question. Sometimes she would reach forward and tap his shoulder when he needed to slow or shift direction. They had become a rhythm of motion and instinct, moving through death together. By midday, the first shells began to fall, distant at first, then closer, explosions tearing craters across the dunes. Marcus felt the shock waves slam against his chest armor, and he pushed harder, pulling the sled behind him. Zira fired back at flashes of light in the distance, the recoil shaking her shoulders. But she kept her aim steady. One of her shots brought down a pursuing drone in a burst of blue flame. She gave a fierce grin and shouted something he could not understand. But it sounded like victory. He laughed, breathless from exhaustion. The sound carried oddly across the empty plain for a moment. They both forgot fear and pain, and the endless horizon. When the bombardment grew heavier, Marcus spotted a wrecked walker half buried near a line of cliffs, its frame still standing tall enough to serve as cover. He dragged the sled into its shadow, the ground trembling as new shells hit nearby. Zira covered his movements, firing at any drone that drifted too close inside the walker's shell. They found an old power core, cracked, but still warm. Marcus saw a chance he could rig it to create A thermal flare. Something bright enough to draw the enemy away from the extraction zone while the fleet shuttles came in. But using it meant staying behind to ignite it by hand. He turned the idea over in his head and looked at her. She must have sensed his thoughts because she spoke quickly in her language. Sharp, commanding words. He caught the meaning she was telling him not to do it, that her life was already borrowed, that he had to leave. She reached for the detonator, but he pulled it, back shaking his head no. He pointed to the sky and said together. She looked at him long, then nodded slowly, her pride breaking just a little. They worked in silence to move the core into position. Marcus stripped the old insulation and linked the fuses with leftover power cells. Sira's hands moved fast, despite shaking. She guided him through alien power symbols, etched on the reactor. Her people had used similar technology, and she knew how to make it burn brighter together. They turned a broken machine into a beacon of light and death. The plan was simple. They would light the flare at the far end of the basin and then run the long ridgeline to the landing point. If luck held, they might survive. If not, at least the fleet would have a clear path. The sky darkened again as clouds of dust rolled in, the twin moons rising early, casting a pale glow over the dunes. Marcus hauled the sled once more, muscles screaming under the strain, his armor alarms blinking red. Sira kept firing bursts, at the shadows chasing them, their trail marked by lines of smoke. Behind them, the reactor began to hum louder and louder. The air itself seemed to vibrate around them. They reached a rocky ridge overlooking the basin below, filled with black shapes, moving like ants, the enemy massing, unaware of the fire about to wake beneath them. Marcus looked back at the glow growing brighter at the heart of the wreck. He could almost feel the heat. Even from here. Zira turned to him and said quietly, her first full sentence in his language, no leave. He smiled at her and said not leaving, ever then pressed the detonator. The world erupted in white light, the ground shaking like thunder. The shockwave tore across the desert, flattening the enemy horde. The blast lit the sky for miles, the kind of sight that would be seen even from orbit. Marcus and Zira fell to the sand, the roar fading to ringing silence when it was over. The basin below was a sea of fire, the enemy retreating. At last he looked at her face, illuminated by the distant flames. She was smiling. The fierce smile of the desert moon was burning behind them, the fire from the reactor still glowing far across the horizon, painting the sky orange and red like a second dawn. Marcus, Hale, and Zira lay in the shadow of a ridge, the shockwave having thrown them against the rocks, their ears ringing the air filled with heat and drifting ash. Marcus blinked through the smoke and saw that the blast had done its work. The enemy swarm had broken, scattered into dark specks fleeing into the dunes. He felt the ground vibrate from distant aftershocks, but for the first time in days, there were no drones circling above, no searchlights sweeping the sand, just silence broken by the hiss of cooling metal. He turned to Zira. She was breathing hard, her armor half melted on one side, her braced limbs bent, but she was alive, her eyes narrow and bright as she looked at the burning sky. She spoke softly in her own tongue, words he could not follow, but the tone was heavy with relief and disbelief. Marcus smiled weakly and said, "Guess we are not dead yet." She tilted her head, not understanding, but she could read the emotion in his face and gave a faint smile back. The ridge they sheltered under led into an old survey tunnel carved long ago by mining machines. The walls of stone and metal carried faint traces of ancient markings, the kind of writing that meant the Cathari had once been here before the war. Maybe centuries ago. Marcus helped her slide off the sled and down into the entrance, the air cooler inside carrying the dry smell of dust and oil. He activated a glow stick, and its blue light cast long shadows across the walls. Zira traced the symbols with her fingers, whispering, quiet words that sounded like prayer or memory. He watched her and felt a strange respect for the weight of history around them. Two soldiers standing inside the bones of a world their ancestors might have fought over. As they moved deeper, the tunnel widened into chambers filled with rusted machinery. Marcus checked his scanner. Faint power readings still running through the old systems, enough to be dangerous. Zira gestured to one of the consoles. She could read the symbols and told him this was a hive node, an old network hub. The enemy must have used these tunnels to coordinate their attack, and now it still pulsed faintly alive with the hive's mind. He realized with a chill that they were sitting right inside the beating heart of what remained of the swarm. He reached for his detonator, thinking of blowing the place and running. But Zira stopped him. She pointed at the roof above them, then at the scanner showing shapes moving closer through the upper tunnels. The enemy was coming, not retreating. She understood before he did. They had felt the flare, and now they were converging to crush the survivors. He looked at her face, calm and determined. She told him in broken human words, "They come, you run." He shook his head. Not. This time she glared and said foolish again, but her voice had lost its edge. She knew he would not obey. He checked his ammo, 1 clip left and a half-drained energy cell. He turned off his visor feed to save power and started planning fast. If they fought here, they could collapse the tunnels and bury the hive core. It would cut the enemy link and give the fleet above time to pull out safely. Maybe that was enough reason to die here. Zira watched his hands as he laid the charges. Her expression softened when she realized what he intended. She began to help her long fingers steady, even as blood ran down her arm. They worked together wordless until the explosives were placed around the chamber in a circle. When it was done, they took cover. Behind a broken pillar, the first enemy shapes crawled through the upper vent holes, spidery machines, half flesh, half metal, their eyes glowing green. Zira took aim with her rifle. Marcus waited until they were close, then opened fire. The tunnel filled with the roar of gunfire and screeches of metal. Tearing sparks flew across the walls. He fought until his rifle clicked empty, then switched to his knife, cutting down one of the creatures that leapt at him. Zira's aim was deadly, every shot a clean kill, but there were too many. They poured through the walls like a flood. Marcus shouted over the noise to fall back toward the tunnel mouth. She covered him, moving on her braces with surprising speed. The floor shook with the weight of the swarm. They reached the last chamber where the detonator waited, the charges wired to the old power core. Marcus turned to her and said, "We light it here." She understood. She raised her rifle again and nodded. The battle became a blur of light and movement. Marcus fought with everything left in him. He felt claws rake his shoulder armor, but he kept swinging. Zira's rifle jammed, and she used the bayonet, stabbing with fierce precision. They moved as one, back to back, the air filled with smoke and heat. Then Marcus saw the core beginning to overload, its glow turning from blue to white. He yelled to her to go. She refused, shouting, "No, leave." She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the tunnel. He shook his head and pressed the detonator into her hand, his voice rough. "Go tell them, tell everyone." She stared at him for one long heartbeat. Then, without another word, she turned and dragged herself toward the exit. Her braces sparking with every movement, he turned back to face the oncoming wall of creatures and fired the last round. The explosion came like the roar of 1,000 storms. The ground split open, the tunnels caving in as fire and dust swallowed everything. Zira was thrown forward into the open air as the ridge behind her collapsed. She rolled across the sand, coughing, her armor smoking. When she looked back, there was nothing but fire. She screamed his name, though she had no breath left to give. Her voice broke into silence. She lay there, under the dim light of the moon, staring at the flames until they faded into darkness. Hours later, when dawn came again, she was still alive, half buried in dust. Her armor cracked, her rifle gone, but she could see movement in the sky. Small points of light descending. The fleet had returned. She smiled weakly because she knew he had done it. He had held the hive and bought them the time they needed. She whispered something in her own language, a word that meant honor or sorrow or both. Then she closed her eyes, letting the rising sun warm her face. Knowing what it meant to be human was not in the body or the species. It was in the act of standing when every law said to fall. It was in the promise kept, even when no one else was watching. Light of the new day was pale and thin across the desert moon, and the air smelled of smoke and glass. The ground still trembled from the destruction of the hive tunnels. Zira opened her eyes slowly, her mind swimming between dreams and pain. The world was quiet, too quiet. The last echo of battle fading into the wind. She tried to move and felt the sharp pull in her side, but her armor held. She pushed herself upright with the help of her broken braces, her throat dry, her mouth filled with dust. She looked around for Marcus and saw only scorched sand and twisted metal. His name fell from her lips, weak and trembling, carried away by the wind. She called again, but there was no answer. Only the hum of cooling stone and the distant whine of engines far above. She stared at the horizon, hoping for his shadow to appear through the heat haze, but nothing moved. Her comm cracked alive, faint and broken, a human voice saying, "Ground team report, survivors." Sierra blinked through tears and reached for the signal. She managed to whisper her name. Her voice barely a rasp. She heard another voice shout, "Coordinates, we see you, hold position." And for the first time since the tunnels collapsed, she let herself breathe. She slumped back against a rock, looking up at the pale moons, and waited. But something in her heart twisted, because waiting meant accepting that Marcus was gone. Minutes later, a shadow passed over her head, the roar of a hopper engine breaking the silence. The small rescue craft swooped low, kicking up clouds of dust, its ramp opening before it even landed. 2 human Marines jumped out, weapons ready, scanning for hostiles when they saw her. They hesitated, unsure what to make of the half-burned alien sitting amid ruins. One of them spoke into his mic, saying, "Visual on Cathari survivor, no human present." Sierra raised her hand weakly, pointing back toward the crater, saying his name again. "Marcus." They looked at her, confused. But then another voice came over their comm, a voice that made her freeze with shock. It was Marcus. He sounded faint, strained, but alive, his words broken by static. "The blast threw me clear, farther north, systems failing, still moving. Can't see the sky, tell them not to leave." Sierra's heart leapt. She shouted into the comm, "Alive, he alive?" The Marines turned their heads, listening to the transmission. One of them nodded quickly, repeating the signal to the pilot, and within minutes the hopper lifted again, heading toward the northern ridge. Sierra refused to stay behind. She pulled herself to the ramp, gripping the doorframe with her claws, and dragged her body inside. Despite the pain, the humans tried to stop her, but she pushed past them, her voice cold and clear. "I go," she said, and they could not argue, because her eyes held the same fire they had seen in every soldier who refused to lose. The hopper raced low over the desert, the wind tearing at her armor. She looked down and saw the long black scar where the tunnels had collapsed, and beyond it, the vast empty stretch leading to the mountains. Marcus was somewhere out there alone. The pilot called out a signal faint ahead, distress beacon, human code. He brought the hopper lower, and they saw movement, a figure waving from a field of twisted wrecks. Sierra's breath caught. It was him crawling across the sand, his armor scorched, his visor cracked, but his body still moving. She shouted his name, and the pilot set the hopper down in a storm of dust. She leapt from the ramp before it stopped, moving her braces, biting into the ground, each step a jolt of pain. She reached him and fell to her knees beside him. He looked up through the cracked visor and laughed weakly, saying, "You never listen, do you?" She smiled through tears, shaking her head. "You promise," she said, and he nodded, still breathing hard, still smiling. He tried to stand but collapsed. She caught him, pulling him against her armor, his weight heavy but welcome. She shouted for the medics to hurry. The Marines ran forward, lifting them both onto stretchers and carrying them back to the hopper as the sky began to darken again. Inside the ship, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, his voice barely a whisper, telling the others about the hive, about the explosion, about how he had crawled through the dust when the fire ended, how he thought he heard her voice calling him back. Sierra sat beside him, holding his hand as the medics worked around them. She did not understand every human word, but she caught enough to know that his heart was failing from the blast shock. He turned his head slightly, eyes half open, and said, "Tell them it worked, the hive is gone." She squeezed his hand tighter and said, "Rest, human, you fight too much." He laughed again weakly and said, "It's what we do." The hopper rose through the atmosphere, breaking through the thin clouds into the dark void of space. The fleet waited above orbit, glittering with lights. Sierra looked out the window and saw the ships like stars spread across the black, each one alive because of him. She whispered his name again like a prayer. The medics tried to stabilize him, but his pulse kept falling when the hopper docked with the carrier bay. They rushed him out into the medical wing. She followed, refusing to be separated despite the protests of officers who demanded to quarantine her. She glared at them until they stepped aside. Hours passed as she waited outside the chamber, watching humans rush back and forth through the glass. She saw the machines. Around him, humming lights flickering then going still. A medic stepped out. Head lowered. Zira felt her chest tighten. She moved past them into the room, ignoring every shout. She knelt beside his still form, the machines silent, his face calm as if asleep. She placed her hand on his chest over the place where his heart had stopped and whispered the ancient words of her clan, a warrior's farewell. But then a sound rose faint beneath her hand, a slow rhythm, the weak but steady beat of a human. Hart, the medic who had turned away, spun back, eyes wide, shouting, "He's breathing again." Shira laughed, the sound breaking like light through storm clouds. She stayed by his side through the night, never moving as the ship hummed around them in orbit. Far above the dead moon outside the viewport, she could see the first light of dawn over the planet below. The humans called it a cold sunrise, but to her it looked like a promise. And she understood that the line between life and death was never clean for his kind or hers. It bent to the will of those who refused to let go. And Marcus Hale had never known how to let go of anything that mattered. The carrier ship drifted above the silent desert moon, its hull lit by the pale light of two distant suns inside its great steel body. The med bay was filled with the low hum of machines and the faint rhythm of a heartbeat that refused to stop. Marcus Hale lay beneath a clear dome, his chest rising slow and steady, his armor stripped away his body, covered in burns and scar tissue that told the story of the battle below beside him. Zira sat with her hands folded across her lap, her head bowed. She had not moved since he had been brought aboard. She had refused food and rest, her golden eyes fixed on the human who had given everything to keep a promise around her. The humans of the ship moved with a quiet respect. None dared interrupt the alien warrior who had bled beside one of their own. She looked strange. Among them, wrapped in armor patched with both Cathari steel and human plating, her broken braces replaced now by smooth new limbs of silver, made by human engineers who said she had earned more than metal. She had earned kinship days past before. Marcus opened his eyes, the light stabbed into his skull, and the first sound he heard was her voice whispering his name. She was leaning over him, her face framed by the glow of the medical lights. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She placed a small water tube to his lips and said quiet, "Now you live." He swallowed weakly and said, "Could not leave you." She smiled, that same rare smile that seemed to come from deep inside her, and said, "Foolish again." But this time the word carried warmth, not anger. She told him that the fleet had survived, the hive destroyed the coalition, saved by his choice to stay and fight. She told him that command had ordered a hearing for both of them because disobeying evacuation orders carried the weight of law. But her tone held no fear, only pride. When Marcus was strong enough to walk, they brought him to the great hall of the carrier. Every officer and delegate from the coalition worlds gathered there. The room smelled of metal and ozone. The flags of a dozen species hanging from the high ceiling. The tribunal table stood at the far end, and behind it, the admirals and envoys waiting to judge two soldiers who had broken orders to save each other. Marcus entered first, his uniform still scorched, his movement slow but firm. Zira followed, her new prosthetic legs moving with quiet grace, her armor polished, the alien marks glowing faint red as if alive together. They stopped in the center of the hall, silence spreading like a wave. The Admiral rose, his voice deep, saying, "Sergeant Marcus Hale of the Terran Marine Corps and Commander Zira of the 7th Talon. You stand accused of insubordination, desertion, and the destruction of restricted assets. How do you plead?" Marcus looked up, his voice rough but clear. "Guilty if it means doing what was right." Zira stepped forward beside him and said in her heavy accent, "Not guilty of honor." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Admiral raised a hand for silence and asked her to explain. She did, in slow, careful words, her voice steady. She spoke of how he had found her left for dead, of how he had carried her across the desert, how he had chosen to save not one soldier but the bond between species, how he had taught her what it meant to fight for someone not because of command or duty but because it was the right thing, she said, in her people's tradition. A warrior who saves the life of an enemy becomes part of that enemy's clan. She knelt before the tribunal and declared Marcus Hale, her brother by blood and oath, swearing the Ketheri life debt before the entire fleet. Her voice rising strong as she said, "This human is Ketheri by my hand, and no court will call him traitor." The hall erupted into noise, some in disbelief, others cheering. The admiral leaned toward his fellow judges, voices whispering. Then he turned back and said, "The council cannot punish what has united us. The charges are dismissed. Sergeant Hale and Commander Zira. Your actions, though reckless, have reminded every world why this coalition exists." The room filled with applause, and Zira turned to Marcus, who stood stunned. He laughed quietly, saying, "Guess. That means we win." She smiled again and said, "We live. That is win enough." After the hearing, they were treated, not as criminals but as heroes. Humans and aliens alike filled the corridors to see them as they walked through the ship. Even the hardened engineers who had once muttered about orders now saluted the pair in silence. Word of what had happened spread, faster than any command could contain. Soon other fleets knew the story of the human who refused to leave and the alien who refused to die together. They became a symbol whispered through every barrack and outpost. The phrase "humans will hold" became a call of courage. Not arrogance, but defiance against despair. Weeks later, when Marcus was cleared for active movement again, he found Zira on the observation deck staring out at the stars below them. The desert moon glowed faintly in the dark now, peaceful its sands hiding the ruins of war. She stood tall, balanced on her new legs, their design a blend of human engineering and Ketheri craftsmanship, sleek and strong. He walked up beside her, and for a while they said nothing. "Just watch the slow rotation of the planet," she finally spoke, saying, "My people build memorial stones for those who fall." She looked at him and added, "I will build one for you there where the hive died." He shook his head, smiling. "Not yet, I am still breathing," she answered, "not for death, for promise." He looked at her unsure, then understood she meant a marker not of endings but of beginnings, a memory of the day when two enemies chose to stand together. He nodded and said, "Then I will come help build it." She extended, her hand the old scars across her palm catching the light, and he took it. Their grip strong like the weight of shared battle outside the window. A fleet cruiser drifted past, its hull painted with new insignia, showing a human and Ketheri crest. Side by side beneath it, written in both languages, was a single phrase, "We stand." Later that night, as the ship prepared to leave orbit, Marcus sat alone in the training bay. Checking his rebuilt armor, he heard the familiar sound of her footsteps behind him. Zira entered holding two practice blades, one made of human steel, the other of alien alloy. She tossed him the steel one and said, "We train together or we forget what kept us alive." He caught the blade and grinned. "Yes, ma'am." They fought in silence, each strike echoing through the empty bay like thunder. Not of violence, but of memory. Two warriors testing strength and trust when they stopped. Both were breathing hard, laughing softly in the dim light. The next morning they left the carrier in a small shuttle heading back toward the moon together. No escort, just the two of them. They landed near the ridge where the fire had burned and the ground still held the marks of the battle. She planted a tall piece of polished metal into the sand, etched with their names and the symbol of the coalition. He stood beside her as the wind rose around them and said, "You know, most people would call this madness." She replied, "No. This is hope." And for a long moment, they watched the sunrise spill across, the dunes painting everything gold when they finally turned back to the shuttle. He looked over his shoulder once more and saw the marker shining against the endless sky. He smiled because he knew the story was complete. The galaxy would remember that a human and an alien once refused to surrender, and together they had taught the stars what it truly meant to stand.